Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Neil Amner, one of the past presidents of a chamber. First of all, welcome to Glasgow Chamber of Commerce webinar on the COVID-19 furlough scheme and a legal briefing on that subject. As you'll be aware, Glasgow Chamber of Commerce has been a leading voice for business over a couple hundred years now. And I think particularly in the last couple of months, we've really stood up to the challenges presented to us by the pandemic and represented the voice of business and campaigned through local connections with Scottish chambers and also British chambers of commerce to get various forms of business support for the business community across the city and across the wider economy. One of the key issues to emerge in recent weeks has been cash flow. One of the key tools to come out of that has been the government job retention scheme, or furloughing as it's now known. You may have picked up from one of the other chamber webinars earlier on a few weeks ago that this scheme actually came from an idea that was first deployed in Italy under their employment law. So I'm delighted this afternoon to be joined by my Anderson Strathern colleague, Paul Brown, who is one of the partners in the employment law team, and Paul focuses on employment law, discrimination and equality issues, and also immigration law. Paul's going to talk us through about 20 minutes, talk us through the furlough scheme, and there'll be a chance for questions and answers afterwards. When we get to that stage, what to do is you'll see on the bottom of your screen, there's a chat button. So if anything occurs to you during the course of the webinar, please just pop a question down in the chat and Alan and myself will pick up on it later on. Alternatively, when we open up to the Q&A session, if you go onto the participants list, there's a button there. There's a raise a hand button, and that will bring you up to the top of the list, and we'll open your mic to let you ask your question. But I think for the time being, we'll invite Paul just to crack on with the walkthrough of the furlough scheme, please, Paul.
Okay, Neil, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. From what I can see on the screen, the person that's got the best view is Neil McCallum. Clearly, he's got nice trees and fields and things there, and the rest of us have got walls behind us. Thanks, Neil, for the introduction, and thanks, Alan, for the opportunity to speak to you. 20 minutes, it's not a long time to talk about this, but in fact, it could be forever. You might feel like it's a long time. I'm assuming that most of you have heard of, at least, and are vaguely familiar with the government's furlough scheme. As Neil mentioned there, currently it seems to have come from Italy. Ironically, it goes back before that. Americans have done this on and off for a while, albeit theirs is an unpaid scheme. But clearly this is the government's reaction to the current crisis, having to lock down, and the impact that it would have on business. Since the lockdown, which was from the 23rd of March, essentially, and that's when the government introduced the scheme just the week before that, and the Friday before that, we have had a situation where there have been numerous updates on the guidance. You might imagine, as you'll appreciate, when the government first announced this, it was a knee-jerk reaction and they hadn't really thought the detail through. And indeed, as you probably will know if you've had to apply for it, they didn't actually have the scheme up and running, the mechanics of it, until the 20th of April. The various iterations of the guidance, and indeed when it first came out, the guidance actually talked about, and the idea behind this when the Chancellor first announced it, was to protect those who would otherwise have been laid off. And when we first discussed this, and we as employment lawyers were all advising our clients and others about this, everything that we drafted and worked on, the assumption was that it would be otherwise laid off. And indeed, that was all the guidance that we had at that time. So we put in place measures and indeed business justifications, as we thought we would have to at that stage, for demonstrating that the reason for this is if we didn't have the money, these people would have been otherwise laid off. When we finally got the guidance, it didn't refer to who would otherwise have been laid off at all. It did mention redundancy, but not as the reason for this. It mentioned that basically that any company that was severely affected by COVID-19 could essentially access this scheme. And that's completely different. So it gave us a much broader approach to this. I'm reliably informed that when the government first put this scheme in place, they intended or hoped that only 10% of employers would actually access this. I think that was a naive assumption. In fact, more than 35% of employers have tried to access or have accessed the furlough scheme, and ranging from very small employers to substantial employers with thousands and tens of thousands of employees. So inevitably, it's cost more money than the government had necessarily anticipated. But the idea that it's severely affected by covers almost everyone. In fact, I'd be fascinated to know if there's actually a company out there that's not affected in some way, shape or form by the COVID-19. So that was the initial inception of the idea to offer protection to individuals and employers so that essentially employers were not making everyone redundant as their business dried up or their work fell off a cliff, essentially. As you may be aware, again, and forgive me if you know about the scheme already, but basically the scheme will reimburse eligible employers 80% of eligible employees' normal regular wage, or up to a maximum of £2,500. And again, when the scheme first came out and guidance was issued, it differentiated from one week to the next. Eventually, we've got clarification that it's 80% or 2,500 of a gross wage. So from that, tax is deducted, etc. But in addition to the 80%, employers are eligible to reclaim national insurance contributions and also the amount that they would have to pay for pension under auto-enrolment schemes. So that's on top of the 80% or the £2,500. When the scheme first came out, it was for initially a 3-month period as the government had from the 1st of March, notwithstanding in fact it came out on the 19th or so of March, it was from the 1st of March. And it was intended to be till the end of May. As you'll probably be aware, it's now been extended to the end of June. The rationale for that wasn't necessarily that it was essential for business to extend the period. It was because employers, large employers who might have to make redundancies, and particularly if they're making more than 100 people redundant, were going to have to engage in a 45-day consultation exercise. And the government suddenly realised that that consultation exercise would take place by middle of April. And some employers were already starting to consider that process, and that's why the government were almost forced to extend it to the end of June. Because of course, strangely enough, we're all aware, we're still in lockdown and we don't yet have the exit strategy unless, and if someone on the screen knows otherwise and can tell me, I'll be delighted if Boris Johnson has been announcing something while I've been working all day. I might add that employment lawyers are fairly busy at the moment, just in case anyone's doubting that we're all sitting at home, furloughed, watching box sets and reading books. But that aside, at the moment, the scheme has been extended till the end of June, and we shall see what happens there. There are particular areas of the economy which, even no matter what Nicola Sturgeon or Boris Johnson et al. Have said, are going to be severely affected. Even if we relinquish or release to a certain extent the lockdown, hotel, tourism, pubs, restaurants are still going to be severely affected. And those areas of the economy and those sectors of the economy are already lobbying the government about, in particular for them, extending the furlough scheme beyond that. But that is a wait and see. We just have to wait and see what the government are willing to do or say in that respect. So we had various, as I mentioned, various guidelines that were issued by the government on how this scheme was expected to work in practice. When the government initiated the actual HMR portal, which was the 20th of June, they issued further guidance, and indeed they issued to everyone the guidance which they were providing to the HMRC. Sorry, I might add, and I should have said at the beginning, I was speaking to Alan beforehand, I will produce a brief summary of what I'm talking about, sort of made memoir. And I'll get it to Alan. He'll arrange to get it distributed to you all so that you can see what we're talking about. And it will have the links to these various documents. So the government issued guidance to the Treasury. Unfortunately, it was slightly at odds with the general guidance that we had from other sources and the guidance that they'd issued initially, which isn't really helpful, strangely enough, but we are working on the assumption that the guidance is now better than it was before. So where are we now? At the moment, furlough, any employees that are on furlough can't perform any work for their employer. That's the simple essence. They cannot perform any work, which of course a lot of employers still need some employees. So other employers have been having to do short-term working or altered change of hours, reduced laying people off, but they need them from time to time. And of course that in some areas of employment, some companies, that's produced malcontent because there are some employees that are being made are furloughed and getting 80% of their wage effectively for doing nothing, and others that are having to work perhaps 3 days a week and yet only getting 60% of their employment. So it hasn't been the perfect solution for all employers. Directors, I won't go into that in detail at the moment. Directors can be affected as well and can be in certain circumstances protected. As far as not doing work, it does allow people to undertake training, provided that that training is not essentially for the benefit or the economic benefit of their employer. And basically employers should be telling their employee they mustn't do work. When we got, and I think it was the third iteration of the guidance, the government finally confirmed that actually furlough can be rotated, but it must be for a minimum period of 3 weeks. So if you put an employee on furlough, in order to be able to get the recovery of the payments, it must be for a minimum period of 3 weeks. But what you can do now is potentially put that workforce, the 60% employees, etc., and put them on furlough for 3 weeks, and then change that and have the next group on for 3 weeks. So you can alternate the people on furlough. One of the other critical things is the agreement must be in writing. So you must notify the employees of this, and you must essentially get their agreement. There's been various concerns raised about that. Of course, you can't really be posting letters out, emails, does it work, etc., but provided you've intimated in writing by email or post or otherwise, and people have demonstrated their acceptance of that, that's sufficient for these purposes. It's not really going to be sufficient just to say, yeah, we sent it out, therefore everyone's accepted. The bottom line with these, the thing about furlough is it is a variation to people's terms and conditions of employment, and you must get consent to that. So people need to be aware of it, because with the exception of furlough and what they're agreeing there, all other terms and conditions of employment remain the same. And this is what's caused a lot of consternation. People are guessing and saying, oh, well, we can do this and we can do that. You can't change everything, and you can't just ignore regular employment law. It has to be that all other terms and conditions are changed unless varied. So again, one of the other, to qualify employees originally, when the government finally came out with the guidance, said that you had to be on the company's payroll, like the PAYE scheme, by the 28th of February 2020. The government have since changed that, and now the deadline is the 19th of March. But that means that they have to be on your PAYE payroll, and you must have submitted the government's real-time information to the HMRC by that date. I'm dealing with a number of employers who have brought people on board. Originally, they were after the 28th of February and they thought they couldn't cover them, but now they do. But actually, their method of dealing with employees is to catch up at the end of a month with the real-time information and submit that so retrospectively to HMRC. But unfortunately, if those employees weren't on your PAYE payroll and you hadn't submitted real-time information by the 19th of March, you can't recover under the furlough scheme for them. So it is important that that paperwork is in place. As far as the furlough scheme is concerned, the intention is it's to avoid redundancy, but it doesn't stop you making redundancies. If businesses are in a position where they know that regardless of what happens, coming out of this, social distancing and other measures are going to have a severe impact on the business, it doesn't necessarily stop employers from discussing and actually entering into redundancy consultation, or indeed effecting redundancies of staff. But the whole point is it's intended to try and avoid that. So I'm not sure the HMRC would look favourably on employers who were making redundancies and also claiming for furlough. But certainly what you won't be able to do is use furlough payments for redundancy. Now, the government haven't actually said that because they feel they haven't had to point that out, but I'm absolutely certain you won't be able to do that. One of the other big issues that is uncertain as well, and people ask about, is holidays and whether you can take holidays. And at the outset, this was very much an uncertain position. Finally, there is some clarification from the government that says that people can take holidays while they're on furlough. What they haven't said, though, but we're assuming because they've actually allowed that, is whether or not, if you take a period of holiday, whether that breaks the 3 weeks. And indeed, whether or not if you took a week off, you would actually need to be off for 3 weeks plus 1 week, or if the 1 week of that can be within the 3. We're working on the assumption that the holiday can be part of that 3 weeks. But previously there was no guidance on it at all. In fact, the employer's guidance has no clarification about the payment of holiday pay, but there's separate guidance that the government have also issued for people who are employees that are affected by this. And in their guidance, it does say, it explains about pay, etc., etc. And if people are actually on holiday, for the period they're on holiday as opposed to furlough, they're entitled to get 100% of their normal wages. So employers need to be careful of that. If they're paying people or making people take holidays, or people are taking holidays whilst they're actually furloughed, they don't get just 80% for the week or so that they are on holiday. They get 100%. Now, where that is particularly going to be of benefit, and where you will see that most likely, is for higher earners who would earn beyond the 2,500 maximum, and they may well wish to top up their income by saying, okay, I'll take a week's holiday at least, and they get that at their full rate, and therefore it would top up their income in a particular month. But it's the employer that must pay the difference. It's up to the employer whether or not, under normal circumstances, they top up the 80% to make it 100% of wages. But when they are taking it as holiday, they must top it up. Sorry, emails are flying into me here and I'm trying to remove them. So what the government haven't explicitly said, though, just in relation to employment, is absolutely whether or not the 80% furlough payment can be used towards part payment of the holiday, i.e. for that week that you're on holiday, can the employer recover the 80% essentially, or the 80%, and use that towards their obligation to make holiday pay? They haven't said you can, but they haven't said you can't. So at the moment we're working on the assumption, on the basis that they've allowed you to do it, to use holidays, take holidays during furlough, that you can in fact use that holiday period and use the 80%. But that comes with a caveat that says they might change their minds, and they're always updating the guidance, so we just need to be aware of that possibility that the HMRC might say, no, that's not covered. The other things you've got to watch out for, just briefly: maternity pay, paternity, parental or adoption leave. If people are on any of them, that's not furlough. So that would not be able to be paid at the same time as furlough. Likewise, statutory sick pay. If you're on statutory sick pay, then that's not furlough time. It may be that if you were furloughed and then you unfortunately contracted the illness, you actually, during the time that you've contracted the illness and are not able or fit to work, you should actually be changed from furlough to sick pay. And then once you recover, you can go back on furlough. It's all very complicated, but if you're getting sick pay or entitled to sick pay, which you would be if you had contracted the illness, then for that period, you're not entitled to furlough pay. So there are a number of complications, as I say. It is not that simple to navigate. It is a changing process. The government's constantly changing it. We will wait to see once they actually provide us with the further details and indeed their plan for us coming out of this, how we progress. But at the moment, that's as much as we know or can say, and we'll just have to wait and see how we go from there. So I'm afraid that is a canter through furlough. And I appreciate you all need to breathe, as no doubt do I, and indeed I'm going to take a drink of water in a second. But at this point in time, and I know there are lots of questions, and to be honest, I think sometimes these are more benefit question and answer sessions than just one person talking about it. I imagine that each of us have different things that have arisen, and I'll share with you what I can in relation to the questions that have arisen from my clients. But I open the floor up to anyone out there who has any specific questions. Neil, Alan.
Okay. Evelyn, I think you've got a question.
Hi there. I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay, Paul. Would that be okay? My first question is, I work with small companies and some have furloughed all their staff and some have had a percentage of staff furloughed. So if I can concentrate on the first question, when we are into the new normal and the furlough scheme has finished, there potentially is going to be some investigation and on authenticity from the government. So is it right to be able, for the companies to be able to have or be able to demonstrate the criteria why they put their staff on furlough, and also if any of their staff were volunteering instead to in another part of the business or separately, so they have that audit trail and they should keep that for 6 years? What's your thoughts on that?
Okay. I mean, as far as the HMRC are concerned, it shouldn't really be their concern or any of their business whom you would choose to furlough. That's a business decision, and I don't think they really have the right, or to be honest, I don't think they're going to have the resources, frankly, to determine why you as a business decided you were going to furlough some people. As long as you've got records of whom there are specific records you have to submit about whom you furloughed for when, etc., and you keep those records, as you say, for the 6 years. You just never know what they might come back with. But it's not for them to decide. It's also not necessarily it's not for them to, and there's certainly no question of this in the guidance, that people can't volunteer for furlough. To be honest, that fits with the whole system, because it's not about them dictating who you put on furlough, who's made redundant, who doesn't get the money, etc., etc. So perfectly acceptable to have volunteers. I will say a lot of companies were concerned about that because a lot of employees didn't want to be seen to volunteer. We don't want to be seen to be to be dispensable or not essential to the business. So we're not going to volunteer. But employers I've worked with, we've had to get that message out there. Look, there's no adverse thought if you volunteer. By all means do so. You're helping the business anyway, so by all means do so. But it's not for the HMRC to check that. One thing that I have been made aware of, so the HMRC, and for most of us that we're talking about, it's good old Centre 1 at East Kilbride, they've developed a dedicated team of people who are dealing with furlough. One of their main concerns, the only thing, well, the principal thing they're going to be checking is about companies who are claiming furlough but actually still have their employees working.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be their real focus,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
because they're fraudulent claims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, that's absolutely great. And if that's okay, I've got a second question. So for the companies who have had their staff on furlough from the start, if there's going to be a decision made to extend the furlough, obviously we've seen the extension from May to June, and if we see it from June to July, do we still have to go back out, obviously keeping in touch and communicating with the staff in furlough, but do we have to get their acceptance again or write to them again to share that furlough will be continued?
You shouldn't need to. I'm assuming that, because I know that the letters that we've been involved in drafting give you that flexibility. It explains it's subject to the terms of the government scheme, which of course, when we first started doing this, we didn't really know what the detail was. So it's subject to the scheme. It's as long as we need it, or indeed as short as we need it, and requiring people to come back. So assuming that your letter covers that broadly, then you shouldn't need to go back to staff. They have, by the letter that was issued and their acceptance of it, they have agreed to that variation to their terms to go on furlough.
Okay. That's great. Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate that. Thanks for your update.
Just while if anybody else wants to think of a question, in the meantime, a couple of things from me, Paul. At this point, you can beat me up after us for throwing low balls out, live, Paul. But a couple of things. Furlough is voluntary, or is it in the sense that you have to be asked by your employer to accept the variation of your contract?
Sorry, go on. Yeah, is there another part, or was that it?
Yeah, I was saying. So what if the employee says thanks but no thanks?
Indeed, and we've had those occasions. I think it is not so much voluntary as requested. Yes. Ultimately, if an employee refused to go on furlough, again, there's issues about. That's when, in fact, back to Evelyn's point there about demonstrating who and why and how. It may well be that an employer has to demonstrate why particulars, not for HMRC, but to an employment tribunal down the line, why they've made particular groups of employees or put them on furlough and required to put them on furlough. If you're in that particular group and your employer says you need to go on furlough and you say, don't want to, no, then you might get involved in a debate, shall we say, or dispute about whether or not you can force them. And ultimately, you may well force employees to be furloughed, even if they don't accept it. But you run into the elements there about possible redundancies, termination, and re-engagement, that you get into a whole plethora of the other employment issues that lead to tribunals. But you could force someone to go on furlough, but you may well potentially have a claim down the line that says you broke my contract because you made me go on furlough, or something along those lines. And I have yet, thankfully, to come across a case with any of my clients where an individual has absolutely refused to be furloughed. Because I think most people recognise it's an essential, and it does keep them in a job. The only people that are probably going to argue about that tend to be people, of course, that earn more than the maximum, the 2,500. But if it is essential for the business, then I think most people have agreed to.
Yeah, I suspect a lot of employees, even in the higher earning brackets, will not want to make themselves a target by standing out from the crowd. My other supplementary question was, as far as this varies terms of employment, to what extent are other terms of the contract varied explicitly or by implications? Of, for example, many contracts of employment have a kind of sole employer clause, non-compete clause. If someone's furloughed, they can't work for you, your employer. They can do some training, but can they work for somebody else?
Well, therein lies the other thing that's odd about this, that when it first came out, the guidance, you can't work, full stop. You can volunteer, you know, things like that. You can do training, you can volunteer, but you can't work for your employer. They then subsequently changed the rules. And so actually you can be furloughed from one employer and then take up employment with a new employer. But it does still have to be subject to the consent of your existing employer. So it doesn't vary the contract automatically. And the guidance that we're giving to employers that are in that situation is by all means allow your staff to work if as long as you can specify still can't be competing. You know, you don't want them going and working for a competitor whilst they're furloughed from you. So yes, you can do that. The other thing that raises actually an anomaly in, well, what I think is an anomaly in it, but it's absolutely the rules, is that you can be furloughed by more than one employer at the same time. So if you happen to have 3 jobs, for argument's sake, all of which earn the maximum £2,500, good luck to you. But apart from that, also you could be furloughed by all 3 employers and therefore actually be in receipt of £7,500 per month, all effectively paid for by the government. It's not that there is a maximum of £2,500 per person, which strikes me as unusual. And also this thing about other employers. I think the reason about why they changed the rule on other employment was because they have a number of jobs, and particularly in the agriculture where they want people to go and pick fruit and vegetables and other such things. And people were not so much willing to do it voluntarily, but if they can make more money doing it, then they'll do it. So that can be done.
Anybody else got a question?
Oh, Neil's speaking, but he's not. Can't hear him.
Alan, can you unmute Neil McCallum?
Hello.
Hi, Neil.
Hi, how you doing? Paul, can you partially furlough somebody? So economic activity returns, I've got enough work for Stuart in the office for 3 days a week, but I don't have 5 days.
Ironically, no. That's the problem with it. And that's something they haven't addressed at all, because from the very outset, this is the other thing, I have clients who have payroll people and their only work is to deal with furlough. And yet that's 1 day a week maximum for them, you know, but they're still needed to do certain functions, but it's only 1 day a week. But because they have a job to do and they have work to do, you can't furlough them at all. And that's where we get into what I mentioned earlier about employers who, and a lot of businesses are in this, that thankfully not every business has just ground to a halt. But a lot of businesses haven't got enough work for everyone all the time. So they're having to put people on short-term working or whatever it is. Now, if you've got a workforce of 20 people, and there's a lot of companies that I know that have got drivers and people out in distribution, you've got 20 people, all of whom you can give 3 days work per week to, and you need them 3 days per week in order to work your shifts and other such things. You have to negotiate with them about short-term working and paying them 60%. But unfortunately, you're not going to be able to furlough them and get 80% of that covered by the government. And indeed, they're only getting 60% of their income, where they'll have pals that are earning 80% of their income for watching box sets. You know, but that's unfortunately the way it works.
Thank you.
It's probably worth just jumping in at this point to say that some of the other government financial support, though, might allow companies in those circumstances to apply for grants and other forms of funding, which would allow them to then prop up the operation and the wages bill for those who they are working part days, but just furlough doesn't apply.
Yeah, indeed, there are. I mean, yes, obviously there are other arrangements the government have put in place in small business loans and other business loans that may be able to access. It's really to keep the business alive effectively, which is good. But yeah, it's not furlough.
Any other questions? Anybody else? Just looking at the screens. I had one more quick question for you, Paul, and that was what is the impact of furloughing on redundancy? So if at the end of the furlough period, or in the meantime, actually, well, two questions actually. One, if during the furlough period, the company decides that it's hit the proverbial brick wall and it has to make redundancies, one, can they go ahead? And two, if you do proceed to redundancy, what basis is redundancy calculated on? Is it on the 100% it was before, or is it on the furloughed 80%, or whatever percentage it is under furlough if you earn more than the 30,000 maximum?
Yeah, good question. Because one, yes, you can still go through a redundancy exercise. The caution would be on that is making sure that you have people have been on furlough for a minimum of 3 weeks before you would terminate their employment by reason of redundancy. Because if you haven't gone through, they haven't had 3 weeks of furlough, you can't recover any of the money. So obviously you would want to make sure it's a minimum of 3 weeks. You would have to go through a redundancy exercise as normal, and there's nothing to stop you making redundancies and still having a group of people on furlough. You can be in three categories. Some people are working, some people are furloughed, and unfortunately still have to make redundancies. Could be that. As far as the amount the payment is concerned, now this is the key issue actually for employers and the issue of redundancies, of course. The whole concern about furlough and most businesses currently is cash flow. It's cash. And at least with furlough, you're getting some cash in from the government, which helps your wage bill. If you're making redundancies, you're going to have to pay out for notice and or statutory redundancy or whatever. If it's contractual redundancy, it could be more, but you have to pay that. The company has to pay that. The government haven't specifically said they won't, but that is exactly the opposite purpose of furlough. Furlough is about keeping people employed. So it is not designed or intended to allow people to use that money to pay redundancy payments. And indeed, I cannot see for any way in which the government will support that. So if you're going to make redundancies, effectively, you're having to meet that cost of redundancy with a notice and redundancy payments.
Thanks. Well, Evelyn, you've a question. Sorry, Alan, can you unmute Evelyn, please?
Hi, Neil. For some reason, there we are.
Sorry, Alan, I think you're unmuting me and I'm muting myself, so I do apologise for that. Paul, I lost connection just as you were talking about the 2,500 capped. Just to make sure I picked up right in between, it is obviously gross and includes auto-enrolment in respect of the pension, and it also includes taxes, and the employers can reclaim the national insurance. Is that right?
The employers can reclaim, so the 2,500 is gross. In addition to that, the employer can reclaim the NI and the pension contribution.
Right, okay.
Only the equivalent of the auto-enrolment element. It's not an additional top-ups, and it specifically excludes any salary sacrifices, anything of that. So there's only some, yeah.
Okay, no, thank you.
Okay.
Now, can I just say there's no such thing as a stupid question, because no one knows all the answers, least of all myself, but I like to hope I know a few more than some. But please feel free to ask any questions you might have or share any experiences. I'm not sure if anyone on the call has accessed the government portal or otherwise, and how user-friendly or non-user-friendly you find it, because that would be useful intel. Evelyn.
Sorry, thank you, Alan. I just wanted to kind of share the sort of human element, Paul. Obviously, if companies are making some of their teams furlough and some not, obviously they have to keep communication with their team members to keep them feeling inclusive as well, because we are going to go over this, we are going into the new normal, and we need to maintain that culture that companies have been so hard in building up as well. So it's just that human element that I'm seeing in companies where they have chosen, as I said, either to furlough all their staff but keep them updated, do some pivoting to see if they can change the outputs of their products and services, or furlough some of their staff, but keep that percentage of staff updated, invite them along to team meetings, say on a Friday. But just so when they do that step change back into the organisation, they feel inclusive or included, and they're able to work with the company going forward.
It's a very important point, Evelyn, because that's the bottom line. You're not allowed to do any work for your employer, but that does not mean to say that you're not allowed to keep in touch with your employer, and more importantly, that the employer should not be keeping in touch with the employees. It's absolutely imperative that you do, not least of all informing them about furlough and how that's going on, but yeah, keeping them informed of business, the developments in the business, how things are going, etc., etc. You need to make sure you keep that communication going. It's good for the company. It's absolutely good for the company, but it's really good for the people that are furloughed. You don't want them feeling isolated. We're all a bit, well, the very fact we're all sitting in our own houses in rooms all on our own is demonstrating that we're all socially isolated, but we can't have people, well, unlike physically, but actually distance and keeping in touch with them. We need to do that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. If anybody else has got any, Alan?
I've got a couple of questions, Paul. One of the things that you mentioned in the presentation today was that you meant talking about training, and you were saying that it cannot be for the economic activity or benefit of the company. And I'm just wondering how that would be defined, because is it training for personal skills? Because I could equally think of things that are sort of sector specific, maybe documentation training for international trade that would ultimately be for the benefit and economic activity of the company in the long run. So I just wanted to be a bit more clarification on that. And also, I had to be question about just what you see the future being for the furlough scheme as well. Do you see that as we begin to go back to normal and we see that as moving out in phases and steps, if we will see the furlough scheme being extended to specific industries, perhaps hospitality, longer than some of the other industries that are out there as well?
Yeah, I can see that. Answering your last question first, I think I can, because there'll be different sectors of work and industry that are more adversely affected for a longer period of time, that just simply aren't going to work with social distancing. I was actually talking to a hotel group the other day, and they were sharing with me something that appeared in one of the catering magazine. Just by example, large hotel in London has a function suite that can deal with 800 people, either at a dinner or indeed a conference. And they worked out, if they social distanced, how many people would go in the room, and it was 50. So, those are there are industries that are just going to be impossible to get straight back to normal. And indeed, who knows when they'll get back to normal, whatever normal will become. So I can see, and they're certainly lobbying for it, the tourism, hospitality, and entertainment industries, concerts, football matches, these things are just not going to be able to come back straight away. So I can see there being issues for them, and government potentially having to protect particular sectors and allow them to furlough for longer. As far as training is concerned, I think that's going to be a matter, unfortunately, for individual employers. But the fact that you're at home and your employer happens to provide you with online training to update your IT skills, which, I don't know about you, but I am learning on the hoof here. I'm using facilities that I never used before, but I assure you, I will be using all the time, as we all will going forward. But so things like that I don't think are an issue. Documentation, I think keeping up to date on developments in documentation, I don't think necessarily will be such a problem, because it's more to do with that's your own business, that's your own knowledge and your own development. So I don't think there's a problem in you continuing to increase your knowledge and development of your own individual skills. What might be different though is, for example, if from an employer's perspective you said, well, look, before furlough you used to do this, but we're not going to need that going forward. While you're off, we want you to learn how to do that. because when you do that, coming out of this, that's what we're going to need you to do. That might be a grey area. So, because it's not for the economic benefit right now, but it's certainly planned and projected to be for the economic benefit going forward. So that's what I think you would need to be a bit more cautious of. Having said that, again, this is back to the issue of, the way the HMRC are going to focus in on is obvious things like companies who are claiming furlough payment and still having people out there working. How they're going to monitor or have the resources to monitor what your staff were doing online or, in their own free time, as it were, instead of watching box sets and reading novels, when they were actually saying, well, look, if I become a whatever, I'm going to do this going forward. How they're going to monitor that, I'm not sure they'll be able to.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, just on that final point, and that actually perhaps, Alan, is if, however, what the employer was doing was paying for employees to be training externally, that would not, I think that would fall foul of it. So, because that would be pretty much saying, well, if we're paying for it, it must be for our benefit. So that would be a problem.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sarah, do you still have a question or no? Okay. Robert, I think you had a question there.
Hi, Paul. I just wanted to find out what your overall feelings have been from the furlough scheme. All kind of businesses I've spoke to have kind of complimented it and said it's been really successful and useful for them. I was just wanted to get your kind of views on that. If you think it's been a success, or do you find there's still kind of issues out there?
I think overall it's been a success. I give most employers I'm dealing with are saying it's worked well. Actually, I've asked people to feedback on the portal, and there's been very little complaint about it, which is amazing, actually, given that it didn't exist as of the 19th of March. And within the space of a month, for the HMRC to get this operative and actually working and paying out is quite impressive, really. So most of the feedback I've got has been positive. The mere fact that it exists actually has been one of the most positive things, because businesses, a lot of businesses, staff are one of their primary expenses, and they would not have been able to continue or support those staff, or indeed probably continue in business with a future business if they hadn't had the opportunity to do that now. So yeah, I think it's been positive.
Yeah, and I think as well with the other schemes have been a bit slower in getting the processes right. I think obviously the furlough scheme seems to have got it spot on, and obviously saved a lot of jobs, which has been a positive thing through this.
Actually, I think on the guidance, and I was talking about the various iterations of the guidance, it's updated almost weekly, but a lot of that has been reactionary, because employers and, of course, pedantic lawyers have been asking questions about, yeah, but what about, and how come, and what happens with this, and what. So they have updated the guidance, and most of the issues that they've addressed are the concerns that people have. So it has been very useful. I agree with you. Not all the systems have been quite as user-friendly, and I think particularly the loans, the access to loans, the banks. Initially the government sort of said, and we expect banks to be able to support this and support businesses. But what banks were saying was, yeah, we'll give you money if you give us a personal guarantee, and you put your kidneys up for sale and all these kind of things. But that, and of course the government had to then step in 3 weeks down the line and say, no, whoa, that's not the route. But that's not happened with furlough, which has been, because it's been directly administered, and the money is directly promised by the government through the HMRC system. So I think it's worked quite well. Yeah.
Okay, well, everybody, I'm just conscious of the time. Thank you all very much for taking time to join the webinar and for your questions. As I think Paul said several times during the course of this afternoon, this is a topic which continues to evolve and grow, and no doubt will continue to do so. Paul, through Alan at Chamber, will send around a set of notes afterwards. The Chamber website will continues to be updated, as indeed does the business hub that we've got up on the Anderson Strathern website, which again we can send you details about through Alan to sign up for updates there. But otherwise, thank you all for your time. We look forward to seeing you soon in another webinar. Hopefully not too much longer before we get to meet you again. But in the meantime, thank you all.
Neil, can I sorry, just say before I go, obviously I'll send that up. Notes is to make it too excessive. A brief summary of what we discussed. But more importantly, and also, sorry, and Neil's talking about the Chamber website and the Anderson Strathern website, the Business Hub. But if anyone wants to, when they've got my details, if you want to link in with me, by all means do so, because we post updates on that as well.
Okay. And our final website to bear in mind is, if you have any further questions on this or requests for our webinars, please contact Alan or very generic marketing at glasgowchamber.com as email address as well. But otherwise, thank you all for your time and for taking part. Thank you.